Good afternoon. All week long, I've seen people come in wearing shorts, and not that I wanted to show off these legs, but I have mine on a Saturday afternoon. So I appreciate everybody being here. And on behalf of, and I'm Dave Treem, I'm the interim town manager. And on behalf of Mayor Montgomery and Town Council, again, I'd like to thank everybody for being at the Jamestown Civic Center this Saturday afternoon. And obviously, not everybody here is a football fan, or they might be watching some football. Today is the culmination of the Town of Jamestown's Property Visioning Workshop. And after today, if you still have additional information to share with Seth Harry and his team, you will be able to do so before a final report is submitted to the town at a later date. And again, the Town of Jamestown thanks each one of you who participated in the process, either in person or online. And the purpose of the public engagement process is to give our citizens an opportunity to shape the design and development of the 460-acre property between Guilford College and Mackey Road. It is good to note that Seth's work will not end with this property visioning workshop, but he will be available to provide leadership throughout the development process. Seth will also provide assistance to Mr. Tom Terrell of the Fox Rothschild Law Group in crafting a development agreement. The result of this process will assist the town in creating enforceable development standards to be included in a development agreement between the town and D.R. Horton, the owner and developer of the property. And I'd also like to thank D.R. Horton representatives for attending all sessions. Obviously, they have a vested interest in the outcome of the process and wanted to meet and hear firsthand what the Jamestown citizens have had to say about what their preferences were for the development of this 467-acre tract. The Town of Jamestown has hired Seth Harry and Associates of Frederick, Maryland, to be an advocate for the town and its citizens. Seth, again, is a community planner, an architect, and an urban designer with 3 decades of experience in designing and land development. Seth Harry is an independent third-party contractor whose sole purpose is to represent the best interest of the town of Jamestown and its citizens. And I would report that yesterday they had a 14-hour day. I'm saying they all look great, but if they're looking a little bit haggard, they have really put in some long hours since they have been here. And at this point, give a warm Jamestown welcome to Seth and his team.
Thank you, Dave. And wow, this has been the longest 5 days of my life, I think. I do, again, want to mention that none of this would have been possible without the help of my team, who I'd like to mention personally. They've worked tirelessly and sometimes just tired throughout the whole week, but these are some of the most talented and dedicated people I've ever worked with, and we are very fortunate to have them with us this week. So Stephen Fett, Justin Falango, Scott White, and Keith Covington were just performing above and beyond all day today and the entire week. So thank you, gentlemen. Oh, let me get rid of this. Excuse me, I hope nobody minds. I would like to say that, as you probably saw, I was putting together the final touches of the PowerPoint as everybody was filing in, and we were still receiving things both from my teammates and also from some of our remote teammates. So this is the first, you and I will all be seeing this PowerPoint for the first time ever in a few minutes. I think I got everything right, but if there are any glitches in there, we'll find out together, because this will be literally the first time I've seen it. in its entirety. A lot of it we've been seeing in bits and parts through the course of the week. I always like to start each new session with a quick review, not only of the previous session, but for the whole process all the way through, because I find it very useful both to myself, to remind myself of how we got here, first of all, and then also for the community to sort of follow along and sort of just revisit some of the conversations that we've had this week and some of the results of those conversations, which I'll also be putting the results up here as well too. The point of that is to sort of see, kind of track the trajectory over the course of the week in terms of community input, sentiment, thoughts, feelings, and comments regarding all of the things we've been talking about. And as Dave said, I would like to remind you, this is not the end of the process. In fact, I think we labeled the final plan, the final draft plan, to make sure, to reemphasize the point that we are actually, again, inviting comment. We never want to waste an opportunity to get feedback. So we're not presenting this as the final plan, we're presenting it as the next step, the next iteration as we continue to move forward. So we're hoping to get additional feedback today as well, because the plan has changed since you saw it yesterday. Was it yesterday? We had the open, yeah, when you had the open house. Also, I asked Keith to give me a little cheat sheet on all the things that are in the plan that we heard from you, so that I'm careful not to miss any of them. But we'll also put this up along with the plan when we're through with the presentation, so you can see for yourself. This is just a very quick inventory of all of the component pieces in the plan that we incorporate in the plan with your help and assistance. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dive on in. Have we already dimmed the lights? Okay. And we'll hope we don't have any technical glitches on this one. All right, so Jamestown, North Carolina, Visioning Workshop, running from September 14th to the 18th, 2021. This is, of course, September 18th, which means we're wrapping up this initial phase. And of course, the website where you can find, I think pretty much everything we've done is on the website, is that correct? Including what we've just done today. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to go back at your leisure and review all of this. Okay, so we're gonna, oh, thanks very much. So we're just gonna go through sort of sequentially the process so far, and just both kind of a quick review of some of the things we talked about and the feedback that we received from the community. So we went through the DOT exercise, which has been doing double duty. We always leave that information up from the opening night because we refer to it throughout the week. And it's also just a reminder to all of us the things that we've discussed and the general basically the general sentiment regarding different issues in the room. But then they made handy boards and we flipped them on the backside to mount the interim work products on. But if you want, I mean, if you look, the dots are all still there on the left. We also, by the way, photographed those the night of the first night presentation. And so all of the survey results, both from those dots and from the online surveys, are documented, and that's what we work from. We work from the photographs themselves to do the percentage of support for each of the various questions asked. So the initial DOT survey preference, what it is, just sort of, rather than go through the whole thing again, it just kind of highlighted I think we had 13 questions. Some of them were sort of kind of divided, so I didn't bother putting those up there, but it's all available, all the information's available if anybody asks. But I just wanted to highlight the ones in which there were significant or substantive preference for one of the answers or the other. So we can just kind of run through those very, very quickly. So the first one was the traditional neighborhood format versus the sort of more conventional suburban pod model. And we had an 89, and this was again a percentage of the participants who responded. So we had an 89% preference for the traditional neighborhood format. We had a 91% preference for the fine grain interconnected internal street network. And I should preface this before I go too much further, that in the opening night presentation, we talked a little bit about these various community development formats and their relative implications, pros and cons, related to each of them. And then we asked the residents to weigh in on which of those things, on specific questions related to those different items. So this was, we talked about the fine-grained internal street network. This related specifically to that opening night presentation. This was rear front access based on lot size, and this is a slash because the first number was there was 60% support for the only rear access to the lot and 37% support for mixed, meaning both front and rear loaded access, which in combined was a preference of 97% for either rear or front loaded. Well, I should say that. This still includes the rear loaded, but also this sort of adds on to that the front loaded where the lot width could accommodate that front access comfortably without the garage doors being the dominant feature in the streetscape. A variety of house types, 97% support in the neighborhood context, 97% support for that. And then so this is parenthetically, if there's multifamily, and that's still, I think, an open question, although there was definitely some support for it, 100% of there was support for multifamily, there was 100% support for multifamily, excuse me, in only the small building unit format. And we showed an example of what we call a mansion flat, which is something that looks like a large single-family house, but with individual condos in it. And there's built examples of those out there in our projects. So that pictures we showed you were actually from some of our projects. Assisted living was kind of interesting. On the in-person survey, we had a 58% preference for no assisted living. But I think there was more support for that on the online one. But if there was, for the percentage of support for assisted living, the preference was for in the context of the neighborhood versus as a sort of freestanding assisted living facility. Neighborhood serving retail and a walkable mixed-use center. I think, if I remember correctly, there was, I think the total, I'm trying to remember exactly, and again, I've got that. Well, we can go back and look at that. And I think, that, again, this is online, so but I think there was a total support of 67% for some retail in the project, but only, I think it was only in the center, in the one walkable mixed-use center, and then there was almost overwhelming support for if there's retail. There was 91% support for small neighborhood serving retail, and the remaining 19% were pretty consistent that they didn't want to see any retail at all. So there's still a little bit of divide there, but there was generally support for small-scale neighborhood serving retail. This was also in response to the first night's opening presentation. We asked three sort of more qualitative questions: what they'd most like to see, what they'd least like to see. Park recreation, green space, consistently always the top answer of every survey throughout the week. There was a lot of interest in a school or a civic amenity. There's some debate as to how realistic a school is at this time, but there was a lot of support for the idea of preserving space for school and or some other civic amenity, community center, what have you. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the plan. Significant amount of the support, obviously, also for trees and a buffer along the periphery of the property and to adjacent neighborhoods. Again, a reiteration of support for a variety of housing types. And then last, and this is in order of preference or mention, small community-oriented retail. Least like to see cookie cutter, low quality, no trees, apartments, large retail, commercial, and of course, in the evening that we reviewed this, I think, which was the second pinup on Thursday night. I read the rest of that list, which was quite extensive, but we won't go back through that right now. So this was the first pinup survey results, which we reviewed, I think, on Thursday night. It gets a little confusing, so the opening night was Tuesday night, the first pinup was Wednesday night, and we asked questions at that pinup, and so these are the results for those. And I don't think we've seen these. Did we see this? We did this. Is this the first time we're showing this? I'm trying to remember because I know we did the open studio, but when did we review? These are from the Wednesday night pinup? Yeah, I think this was a continuation of the first night pinup. So again, most preferred plan. Oh, this was when we put up the plans, Susie. That's right. I keep forgetting we did those initial plans Wednesday night. Okay. So we had 3 plan options. There was about equal support for A and C, and 80% of that support collectively was positive. So that's a very strong indication that both of the plans were well liked, and I think they're right over there, in fact. And when asked, what did you most like? Not surprisingly, green space buffers, natural areas, keeping the commercial small, connectivity, pods, defined neighborhoods, so I guess there were still some holdouts for that, recreation, park spaces, and still, again, there were some people who did not want any commercial at all. So it's pretty consistently, both in terms of the priority of the ranking and the preference and the specific issues I talked about. I like to just throw this up again because at that time I think we were talking about the deliverables. So this is sort of what we were saying you would be getting today, something along those lines. And so, and the other thing that we talked about repeatedly, which I think we finally sorted out, was the meaning of those colors. And I need to warn you that in spite of our intention, did we get a legend on the plan? Okay, good. Well, they're not up here, but we do have it on the plan. But the colors are much more legible on the plan we're doing tonight, so hopefully that issue will no longer be a problem. Compatibility with the 2007 comprehensive plan from a policy point of view. This idea that a neighborhood has a general format of a neighborhood center, neighborhood general, and neighborhood edge condition. Again, the color's awful there, but the neighborhood center is, as the name suggests, typically located in the physical center of the neighborhood, and it's the most compact and where the most smallest lot residents typically reside, but it's also closest to neighborhood amenities and services. The general is both the largest area, but also has the broadest range of house types and most diverse range of house types. And then the edge, typically, particularly in a context like this, is usually where we always put the largest lot, single-family detached houses. And of course, this photograph is from right down the street. And when we say largest lots, you have to qualify that because the average size of the lots over here in Forestdale is about 1/3 of an acre. I just realized, maybe it is in here. I think I've got it in here. There was some discussion about sustainability. We talked about the Carolina Coastal Conservation, or Carolina Coastal Conservancy. They did a very detailed study analyzing the different water impacts of natural conditions, sprawl condition, and town condition. And of course, a lot of that is based not only on the reduction of the developable area in comparison to a conventional suburban development, but also some more best practices in terms of stormwater management for water quality and so forth. And there was a discussion earlier on about carbon capture and so forth. And all of this is really sort of part and parcel of that same conversation, because this is preserving much more of the natural vegetation on the site and less disturbed soils, which is a huge contributor, obviously, to sediment in the waters and various other issues, and also nutrient load in water. And then the other thing, though, that we didn't talk about, which is probably at least as important as this, if not more so, is most of these communities also, in part because of the way they're designed, and also because they often include neighborhood services either within the community or proximate to it, those 12 suburban vehicular trips that each household produces every single day. But even if you're making those trips, by making them either closer to home or within the context of your neighborhood, you are dramatically reducing the amount of vehicle miles traveled per year. And this is, again, very well documented, or the idea that you can park once and walk as opposed to parking and driving and parking and driving and parking and driving. All those things, not just within the community itself, but in the larger community, dramatically reduces the amount of asphalt impervious surfaces just in the community at large, but also reducing that VMT dramatically reduces the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced just in the course of our daily activities. So this is actually a huge issue and a very big part of one of the benefits of this type of community development, besides the fact that they create very attractive and very popular communities. So again, just a quick reminder, community types, the new traditional neighborhood model is neighborhood-based, it's walkable, it's connected, it provides housing choice, range of house types and price points, and typically it's mixed use, but not always. And by the way, the mixed use, if it's set within a context where access to those neighborhood goods and services are already in place, then because we always do these in the context of the community in which they're based. So we look at the market as a whole, we look at the need as a whole, and then and that's a whole other conversation, but there is a way that we look at that so that we make sure that wherever we build, whatever we build, fits into the community that's in which it's part. Okay, I'm just gonna take a quick breath. Excuse me. I kind of slept in today. I didn't get up until 5 a.m., so. Thank you. Okay, that's better. So we talked briefly, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in relationship to this plan, because I think it's an important point to remember. We had a couple of questions early on about how many units we thought this plan was going to generate. And of course, we were still in the process of generating it when that question was first asked, so we really didn't have a specific answer to that question at that time. I think we do now, is that correct? Or we might, but at least we have an idea. Just, I don't know, because I haven't seen it yet myself. So as soon as I know, I'll be happy to share it with you, if we have it, and I may be wrong about that. So, but this is a fairly comparable project, at least in terms of size. It's 352 acres. This is Kentlands. This is the first large-scale primary home community, I believe, in the U.S. built based on these principles since probably the pre-war era. And it had an average gross density of 4.5 units per acre, or an average of a little under a quarter of an acre per lot. And again, we talked about the idea is that all of what you see there is part of that calculation. The lakes, the parks. This was the original farm that was where Kentlands got its name. And so those are amazing community amenities, and they're very well used and very much appreciated. But in order to create and preserve those kinds of resources and assets, that meant that some lots obviously had to be less than a quarter of an acre. But even still, there are large single-family detached houses within that community as well. But these are some of the amenities that those smaller lots create for the community as a whole. And we compared that again to Forestdale right down the street, which there was supposed to be a point in there. The average lot sizes, we measured them on Google Earth, were 0.32 acres apiece. So the net and the gross, comparing Kentlands to Forestdale as a neighborhood were actually relatively close. And so that means that there are probably a lot of lots within Kentlands that are very similar to Forestdale. And we sort of use that as our baseline in designing this community so that this property, so that we would be sure to have a significant number of lots that meet that standard. So these are the two of the three initial plan concepts that started to lay out the basic structure. And I don't know if I have the neighborhood diagrams on here, but you'll probably remember that in the open night presentation, that was about the size of a neighborhood based on a 5-minute walk. That was about the size of a neighborhood based on a 5-minute walk, et cetera, and et cetera. So the structure of the plans, even at this early stage, both the structure and the makeup or the nature of the property itself, its intrinsic features and characteristics of creeks, steep slopes, vegetation, et cetera, largely define the diagrammatic configuration of the plans. So it's not a coincidence that they look relatively similar if you were to kind of squint at them. But even within that basic diagrammatic configuration, you can see even in the course of one day and two different designers, you started to see differences in terms of how each designer interpreted what we heard from the community and its application on the site. And that gave us the beauty of this, and one of the reasons why we take this approach is that it gives us the ability to talk to both plans and try to gauge analyze each one relative to both how closely it met the community's expectations, how well it responded to the principles and underlying principles that we discussed, and so forth. And we got a lot of very useful feedback from both of these. But the most important thing is that they were both well liked by the respondents, and they were sort of kind of evenly split in terms of which one was, in terms of the preference. But that probably reflected to a certain extent. For instance, this had a little bit more of an organic layout. This one was a little bit more regular and formalized. And I think also the one on the Plan C looked like it had a little bit more open space, which I think was actually mentioned on a number of the responses. So we took those two plans and we did the first draft composite plan, which tries to sort of merge both of those. Tries to sort of, I think I did it again. Sorry, I hit the wrong button and knocked it out. I think it's a button on the mic or something that I accidentally pressed. No, maybe not, maybe on that thing. I think I kicked it out of the... What? Oh, is it? Are you talking about? Oh, the power. What? Just tell me what. I think I did it in the PowerPoint. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Sorry about that. So this was sort of the first pass at trying to combine the two plans. And so if it looks like you see elements of both in there, that's not an accident. Each time we redraw the plan, though, we always go back to square one. We look at the topo. We have a very detailed topographic maps. We have information with steep slopes, stream buffers, and so forth and so on. So each time we redraw the plan, we're constantly making refinements to the plan to try to make it as responsive and accurate to all of those constraints and parameters as possible. And then also you'll see different, sort of the designers will try different ways of reconciling some of the things. But you see right here, for instance, this green right here and this green right here, you're still seeing a lot of the same ideas, but slightly in a slightly different configuration, both in terms of trying to merge the two plans and also as, you know, they resolve them more closely with the topography. And if you don't mind, I think I'm going to show over here that park right there in the middle of this neighborhood on the board, as well as this park right here, are there because there was a large stand of trees in this area, and this was a high point on the site. So when we see something like that, we want to kind of capture it and make it an amenity, both because it has those unique characteristics, but by putting a square there, we're able to save as many of those trees as possible. And again, both keep them as an amenity, but also as a shared amenity for the neighborhood and the community as a whole, and because of that high point. So that was still there, but then when we started looking more closely at the topo in that area, we realized that there was a significant draw that kind of came up here and actually touched on that. So we let that come all the way up to that green so that now you have what we called, within the team, in talking about it, we called this a peekaboo. So it was like an opening where all of a sudden the neighborhood opened up to the adjoining natural habitat. And we really liked that idea because that was basically the site talking to us. And so that idea, we did a quick sketch of that early on to talk about and share with the community later. You'll see it here shortly, but it's also a snapshot because that's where we were at that particular moment on that particular day. And the plan already evolved from there. But the idea, once it's in there and we recognize that that's a feature that needs to be captured, it stays in the plan in one form or another. So there's the neighborhood structure we talked about on opening night, the 4 neighborhoods, which have really become, I think, you know, again, because this is mostly driven by the topography, the defining characteristic in all the plans. Take a moment also to mention that we have not done, I think this is in the final plan, but we did not do a specific proposal either for this part of the plan or that. We did look up there at the upper northwest corner, but the topography was challenging, the access was challenging, and so we decided to keep our focus on the main property, and those are, to a certain extent, really sort of incidental to our primary focus anyway. However, I will say that all the things we've discussed for the primary parcel could influence and be applicable to those as well. Okay, so at that time, and I believe this was the Thursday night pinup, we did a illustrative platting on a detailed plan just to kind of help talk again about this idea of retail center, a neighborhood center. Is that somebody correcting me? Neighborhood center, thank you. Neighborhood general condition, which is this slightly lighter shade, and then neighborhood edge. And so you can see the lot sizes change within all of those areas. We also talked a little bit about the idea of sort of, again, incorporating the existing tree line into the plan and kind of preserving that edge. And then there was a large depression here, which unfortunately the color doesn't show, but we decided to make that, it would have been very problematic to build on without a lot of grading. And so we decided to sort of both make it a feature of the site, but also a gift to the adjoining neighborhood of open space. So this is kind of interesting, this juxtaposition. This is a peekaboo from in the neighborhood out to a forested, vegetated nature, and this is a peekaboo into the neighborhood in what is essentially kind of a meadow. And so that's the kind of give and take that a thoughtfully and sensitively designed plan can give you. Because at this time there was still a lot of confusion about neighborhood edge, neighborhood general, neighborhood center, and we were having a lot of trouble with the colors on the plan, went back and again, this is the neighborhood edge, showing where that would be. Anywhere you see this color, that would be that condition. That would be large lot, single family detached, typically backing to nature, neighborhood general. smaller houses on smaller lots, very walkable sidewalks, et cetera. By the way, on the neighborhood, depending upon where it's located within the community, sometimes the neighborhood general typically has curb and gutter and sidewalks, but on the neighborhood edge, you may have no curb and gutter and no sidewalks. But again, that's a detail issue that could be continued to be discussed. Meaning it was more context sensitive. And then, of course, the neighborhood center here, just in this one location, we talked about the option of allowing a limited amount of retail only in that neighborhood center. And again, all of this can be coded specifically in the development agreement or the master plan, so that even though the neighborhood center as a neighborhood structure, the retail, you could designate where where the retail might be located in what neighborhood and what location. So this is, again, something that the community can decide. And that right there, I think this is going to come up with a sketch. So this is a detail of that. Sorry, it was a little overly dramatic. But this was actually sketched, I think, Tuesday night when that plan was a rough sketch. And then this went to our remote renderer, Peter Roper, and I got that back, I think, right after, I think I got that back on Friday, so it wasn't in time for the Thursday night pinup. But again, it talks about this idea that we overlay the neighborhood structure on the topography. In this case, this is that internal neighborhood connector road that traverses through the center of the neighborhood. That's that green that you saw in the plan, and then this was this peekaboo feature that we kind of captured. So if you lived in this neighborhood, or you were passing through on your way from one neighborhood to another, you would not only have this nice neighborhood green, but as you're passing through, you would get access to walking trails in that view. And of course, these would be the larger lots on the periphery of the neighborhood. So it's a little easier to see and understand in that context, obviously. So this was the second pinup, Thursday night survey results. What was liked about the draft plan: green space and buffers. Again, by far the most popular response. The overall design and layout, which is kind of interesting because this is the first time you're seeing feedback directly related to the plans that have been produced. Because up until this point, we were just talking about these principles in general terms. And now we're getting feedback based on the specific plan concepts that were developed and presented. Small mixed-use retail. At this point, we only just showed it locationally. We didn't talk about it in the specifics, but there's still, again, some support for that. Keeping old farmhouse, that's been a consistent request all the way through, and we have, the final plan has it, and incorporates it into a very nice special area for the community. I'm sorry, I keep leaning on this thing. But that was another one, a recurring theme, connectivity, recurring theme, and the alleys reloaded. Surprising amount of support for that, and it was pretty consistent throughout the process. Still missing from the plans, these are the things that at the time that we made this presentation, either were still in flux or had yet to be definitively located. School community center, which we intended to put in there, just hadn't made it yet. The overall design concern, not quite sure, but specifically that related to traffic. I think there was some mention about traffic calming and things like that. Green space and buffers, retail concerns, architecture building type concerns. So interestingly, just looking at that, the missing from the plan was more generic, and the things they liked about the plan were now becoming much more specific as there was, or as the plans continued to evolve and there were things to respond to. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a peek at the sausage being made. This is normally behind the scenes, but we thought because each of the designers were working with a different colored pencil, it made for an interesting graphic. But this was the previous plan, which was the plan that was produced, the first composite plan that came from the two plans on the left, A and C. And we started working on this Friday morning, I think. Yeah, thank you. So we were working on this when we went through the open studio on Friday morning, which I keep forgetting was yesterday. So because of the size of the site and the pace at which we were working, each of the 4 designers sort of took one of these neighborhoods and began to continue to refine it based on what we had heard. And like I said, people were coming in while we were working and looking over our shoulders and asking us questions, making comments about what we were working on. But you can see how the plan over here is already starting to refine. Because even though this was a good representation of those 2 plans combined, we knew, even as we were drawing that, there were opportunities to make additional refinements, make the plan even more tightly fitted to the site, recognizing also that the better we were able to fit the plan to the site and still meet all the goals and objectives and principles, that would be more open space saved, less grading, and more of both the original habitat and the character of the land retained. So every time we redraw the plan, we go back and we revisit all of those things, and we try to make it as good as possible. So you're already, again, starting to see the next generation at work, and we pieced them all together to create another composite plan, and it's a little hard to see it in those color ranges, but we then copied it onto in black and white and then drew it into the final plan, which is what you're looking at right there. Excuse me. So the plan that you saw a second ago became this plan. And now it's finally drawn in a way that allows you to see it in its entirety. And also, we colored this digitally. So this is the first plan that we've colored digitally. So we were able to have much greater control over the color palette. So here you can see, again, this idea of the center, general, and edge condition is much more clearly articulated and much easier to see. And you can also see it in relationship to the site itself. I'll just walk you through very, very quickly. This was neighborhood 1 or neighborhood 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, the 4 neighborhoods, the same what we had before. What you didn't see in the previous plans is this, which is the restored farmhouse right here, the new school or civic center site, and a new ball field. That's a regulation-sized soccer field, I believe. Is that correct? Yes. So we've taken sort of a semi-forgotten, relic, remnant of the site and turned it into an entirely new civic center that not only supports this community, but because of its location, is easily accessible by all of Jamestown.
Approximately how many acres is set aside for the school?
I'm sorry, the question was how many acres were set aside for the school? 5 acres, which does not meet the standard for probably for public school, right? And we understand that. Our understanding is at this time there is. I'm sorry. Yes, and you wouldn't meet the demand warrants for one, but the idea again is that if you wanted to have a place for a charter school or something like that, they have a much more modest expectation or need with regard to site size. But more importantly, if it's not a school, it could also be community center. There's a lot of things that you could do in 5 acres if not a school. So what we've done is we've identified a site that a school could, and by the way, a lot of the communities that we work in, we specifically challenge some of the site criteria, the site size criteria for public schools, and some communities have been successful in getting them down to a more realistic and manageable size, and so you never know. But it's in the plan now. And it is the best location for that kind of a shared community amenity and asset, because it's both shared by both this property as well as the larger Jamestown community. So again, talking about neighborhood center, neighborhood general, neighborhood edge, neighborhood center, general, and edge, et cetera. But there's a lot of very specific detail features here that are now starting to really come into focus. There's the meadow properly colored so that you can actually see it. We're connecting these neighborhoods with this long linear park or green feature, another one here. And this is really responding very much to the topography. And so when we have a ridge like this that's big enough to support one block or double-loaded street, but not enough for two, one way to respond to that is to go ahead and take advantage of the additional space and put it into a shared amenity like that green. This is the gas line right away here coming through the site down here. And some of the things that we talked about throughout the week are now becoming more self-evident. The vegetated buffer here along Guilford College, which is retained in place. The very small neighborhood serving commercial center here at the intersection of Guilford and Guilford College Road. We're also now showing the stormwater management facilities that are much, much smaller than based on the assumption that we will have the ability to put in things like bioswales, bioretention ponds, and so forth within these greens, and we're actually showing one there. So we are capturing the rainwater where it falls, and we're getting it infiltrated into the ground, and all of these things are both more ecologically sound, but they also maximize both the developable area of the site and preserves as much of the natural habitat and surface hydrology as possible of the existing property. I'm going to go through each of these neighborhoods here in a little more detail. And I'm going to use my cheat sheet here. So we're going to do this northwest neighborhood first. So at this blown up scale, I knew this was going to happen if I didn't put the top back on. Okay, we talked a little bit about the soccer fields. Okay, so the entrances here to the neighborhood correspond with the existing street network here off-site. This is the small neighborhood green. And typically, the other thing that we do with the neighborhood plans like this is that you see the green, that's where, again, the neighborhood center is. These might be where the townhouses might be located. And then we also have a neighborhood, whether that might be a pool or something, or a smaller community center that's specific to that neighborhood. They're typically located in the center and closest to and most convenient to the most number of people. There's a blow up of the soccer field. That's the existing farmhouse right there, and that's been turned into a formal garden, restored formal garden. And so this whole piece here collectively becomes a tremendous community asset for, again, both Jamestown as a whole and this community. And because now we have the plan, you can see it much more clearly. This colored area represents the idea of the neighborhood general condition, which we've been talking about since Monday night. Here's another, there's a lot of other things that we're talking about here too, which you're starting to see. These connections here follow the original connections that the owner's engineer had indicated would be the most, at least impactful on the community, on the existing site. But we also looked very, very carefully at another potential connection here, which we do think is feasible. And once we have all of those pieces in place, you can see you have a much better connected community as a whole. And all of those connections go directly from, neighborhood center to neighborhood center to neighborhood center to neighborhood center. And so you can visit all of your friends and neighbors within the community without having to go out onto any of the adjoining surface road networks. The other thing which you're going to see shortly is we have diagrams showing we have an integrated trail system here shown, and when we get the diagrams, you also see how the street and road network lays out on the site very clearly. And we'll talk about that in a second. I think I must have, this is the glitches. I think I was going to change that to represent another location. Oh no, this is it. It was the, but we talked about this already. This was just kind of highlighting. I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, Scott, or if there's anything I'm leaving out, feel free. Scott did a lot of the design work on it. If there's anything I'm leaving out that I failed to mention, feel free to jump in. There we go. So I think we've seen that a couple times now. If you have any questions, I would recommend that you ask Scott about that afterwards. And Scott's designed a lot of formal gardens. He's also done a lot of nature trails. I've got some copy up here of some of his trail details and so forth. We're going to try to get them into the PowerPoint. I just ran out of time. But again, this is kind of interesting. So you have, and the other thing that we did is these connections were aligned specifically to limit the length of the dead-end road. So we've dramatically reduced those from the early diagrams and to better facilitate the connections between all the neighborhood centers. And then the other thing is that you see things like this, where when you're in the neighborhood center here, instead of either having to walk all the way around, these will connect directly to the trail system, so that you can, if you live here and you have a friend there, you don't have to go all the way around there in order to visit them. And you'll see that more closely when we get into the diagrams. And so this idea, what you're seeing here, just to blow up here, so this was essentially a dead-end road in the earlier version of this plan. So we both shortened the distance to a connection, but now we figured out how to bring the road through and down and connect it to this neighborhood here, which was something we looked at and studied very, very carefully. So you're really going from a transition from a neighborhood center to a neighborhood edge, actually right out into nature. Or here, as the case may be, like out here at Forest Hill, out your back door into nature. So you'll have access both from private lots, but also from the neighborhood as a whole. Many, many ways to access those trails and to navigate around the community on foot, bicycle, or car. So this was a sketch of what that area I just showed you as you're coming off of that ridge and then down the hill and into the adjoining neighborhood. And this was the only drawing I had. I did a quick sketch of this last night, refined it this morning, sent it to Peter. Peter was working on another sketch as well. I got this black and white line drawing of it about 2 hours ago, and about 2 minutes before 3, I got the color version, which you'll see in a second. But it helps you to see a little bit about the process, how we work, and how we go from the plan to the specific to the three-dimensional. And this idea of sort of showing, again, these are the neighborhood edge conditions transitioning to nature. And there's the color version. So I think I'm kind of bouncing around here, and I apologize for that, but I think we're just talking about these linear parks, and this was an access point here. That's actually, I think, one of the trails right there, and here's the other trail system. So there's no shortage of ways to navigate around the site, and you can. We didn't get the topo on here, which I think would have been really helpful, because some of the earlier plans we had the topo kind of reading through, but we'll have that. I mean, you can still read it pretty much directly from the plan, and we'll have that on the final documents. And then this was another, we talked a lot about retail early on and throughout the week. These are all neighborhoods. So they have all the same principal characteristics of center general ed condition, but one of these neighborhoods connects to a intersection that connects to the larger community, and it would also be one of the main entrance points into and out of the community. So if you were going to do neighborhood retail, you had two options for it. One is to put it entirely internal to the project, as you see here. The other one is to bring it out to the edge. And our experience, we've been doing retail in our community design projects for 30 years. So we have a lot of experience with both of those scenarios. Generally speaking, the retail survives and prospers much better if it has access to a larger consumer market. And so we typically recommend that we place it, particularly where you have a signalized intersection like we have here, in an area that would benefit from that additional foot traffic or consumer traffic. And that allows you to provide for a better quality of retail goods and services for all of the residents here, who would be the primary consumers to take advantage of that. Now, I've worked on projects where they had retail in a community like this, where the community was somewhat remote from the existing consumer market, and then the retail was brought into the neighborhood, but it made sense because there really was no local consumer market to take advantage of Habersham and Buford's project, where it's been really sort of almost internally a community amenity. But it was typically, most of the shops and so forth were actually run by residents who lived in the community. So it is possible to do that, but our experience is in a situation like this, it's better to take advantage of that if you have it, both for the benefit of the merchants and also for the community as a whole. So but it's important to remember that even though where the buildings are located is the general area where the retail would be located, it's again still small and community serving, but it's still within a neighborhood. And so we have a neighborhood green here. This would be more the commercial plaza where you could have outdoor dining and so forth. And then the neighborhood center here again is residential. So most of this neighborhood is still primarily residential with all of the characteristics of the other neighborhoods, just in a slightly more convenient location in terms of access. This is the neighborhood center, but this is the only neighborhood center where we have indicated that retail would be allowed. They would not be. And again, we could code for that, but what we heard was small, and if you're going to only have a small amount, we would suggest that we would recommend that that be done only in one of the neighborhood centers. And because of the nature of this, now because of the design of the community, where you're able to access that center from every single neighborhood within the community, we think this is a reasonable location for all the retail in the community. So it's a little bit of a balance between some of the different comments we heard. So again, getting back to our original illustrations of what neighborhood center might look like, small scale, neighborhood serving retail, and probably a little bit higher percentage of townhouses and things like that, so that the people who want convenient access to those goods and services have the option of securing it. And then this was let's see if hopefully it'll load. This was the rendering of it, and I got a little bit out of sequence here with the slide. So this circle right there represents the minimum, the most minimum area of this neighborhood, which is still primarily residential, in which the retail would be located. So the idea here is that this would be the smallest retail node, if you will, with some shops around here. This is an outdoor plaza. Unfortunately, this is what happens when you're going fast and your renderer lives in another country. He's actually in Montreal, and I'm sending things back and forth to him. This was supposed to be what we call an attached green, so it came all the way out here, and he put a road in here, which isn't actually there. But this is essentially a large plaza, community plaza, where you can have community events and so forth and so on. Pardon me? No. This is exactly like, we had pictures of two-story retail. I mean, a retail either with small office or potentially apartments maybe for employees that work in the shops or the owners of the shops, all of which are options in many of the neighborhoods. But these are all basically two-story buildings with ground floor retail, which is consistent with the images that we were showing before. This is shown as townhouses, basically. Townhouses. So this is very much like the diagram that you saw previously. And then as you can see here, again, this is an illustration, but you can see they start to transition to single-family detached here on the periphery. And these actually back right to nature. So this, if we go back, I'm going to go back here one slide to the plan. So what you're looking at is this image across here. So that's that little retail node. This is that internal green. So this is sort of if you're a resident in here and you don't want to come up here and go through this little small commercial area, you can just do a right in here and bypass the whole thing. But this is also a potential place where you could get some other retail functions and/or community functions to take advantage of that green. So this is an internal green. So these are the townhouses that you see in the image, and then they transition to single-family detached out here, just like in all of the other neighborhoods. So this neighborhood, even though it has a small amount of retail, is about 90% residential. So this is that internal square right there. And by the way, this is another thing we talked about early on right here, which was these small mansion flat townhouses, that this would be a great location for them because, again, these are people who like the convenience of living in a maintenance-free house, but also within walking distance of daily needs, daily goods. By the way, these are based on a type in another project that we did that I worked on. I don't remember what they sold for originally, but I checked on Zillow, and they were about, I think they were about $700,000 3 years ago, and I think they're over $1 million now. Now, I forgot to mention that they're across the street from the Gulf of Mexico, so that certainly influenced the price a little bit. But the point is that they're not slumming it over there, and so they're perfectly nice apartments, I should say condos. But the bulk of the value, as with everything else, in that's Rosemary Beach, by the way, if you're familiar with it. So they've continued to escalate in value very nicely since they were originally built. So I call this sort of the small, medium, large. So the nice thing about this, and this is very typical of the way we design these projects, because we're only literally 4 days into this process, and the community will have multiple opportunities to weigh in on this. And so the idea is that this is what we heard: keep it small and neighborhood serving. But if you want something that's a little bit more intimate to your community, this would be like the medium. You could also add this component over here. And then once you have these two sort of anchors, if you will, within your neighborhood center, there would be some justification for adding additional retail to connect those. But that's completely up to you. I'm just saying that the nice thing is that if you decide, well, the retail isn't as bad as you thought it was going to be, you could certainly add more. Or if you want to just keep it very small and intimate, you have that option as well. That's up to you. We got a lot of questions about yield or density, and so we wanted to do a illustrative platting sample in one of the neighborhoods just to begin to get a sense of where we think we might end up with this. And the thing that's, if you sort of think that you're kind of painting, if you will, with these colors, but those colors represent different building types and different unit mixes, it gives you a sense of the flexibility of the plan. We still have not yet, I think, done a comprehensive unit count for the project as a whole, but we have done an initial analysis of the amount of developed land that this plan represents relative to the existing undisturbed site, which we'll get into in a minute. But this is a good illustration of, again, the smaller lots. These are narrow, single-family narrow lots, and/or potentially townhouses. Then this is neighborhood general, which is a little bit larger, probably exclusively in this market, detached, and of course the larger lot, single-family detached. And this, again, this is Mackey Road up here, just for reference. So we've provided a very appropriate, both with the frontage of the existing tree lines, but also houses, the like-to-like, which we typically like to do. So we're creating a very, I think, inviting frontage to the residents and neighbors across the street. Okay, plan diagrams. So these we usually do once we have a plan, a final plan or a final draft plan, as the case may be. We do a series of plan diagrams just to make it a little easier to see the component pieces that informed our process and how they relate to the street. This is a little bit misleading because this is based on the right-of-ways. The actual street widths are quite a bit narrower than that. But you can see from this is the street network that it meets the standard that the majority of the participants in this week's events asked for connectivity. And I probably should have overlaid the neighborhoods on this, but I'll just kind of draw them in for you here with the laser pointer. So you can see very clearly the structure of the neighborhood centers and the interconnecting, internal, and the important thing is this internal connector goes from neighborhood to neighborhood. It's not dividing the neighborhoods, it's actually connecting and uniting the neighborhoods, which is a key feature. When you look at the retail here now in context with the overall site, you can see it's actually a very, very small and modest amount of retail. This is interesting. This is the natural areas. So this is all of the parts of the site that are essentially will remain untouched and could be and should be able to be developed with a minimum of disturbance of the existing habitat and vegetation. And we did a very quick analysis, digital analysis, which you see up there, the summary of which you see up there. Out of a total of 467 acres, and I need to clarify very quickly that that does not include, obviously, this large utility easement here, and it did not assume any development on either of these two parcels at this particular time. We have 160 acres of developable land and roads in the remaining of the parcel, which means that of the existing, sorry, I keep missing of the overall site, we're only using 34% of the overall site as disturbed or developed area. Now, of course, that's a pretty remarkable ratio, but in order to hit those yields, in order to make this possible, that means that obviously you need those neighborhood centers and those higher density houses. Yes, ma'am, very quick. Well, they are now, yes. Yeah. Yes, and we have a gentleman on the team, where'd Scott go? Who has worked on dozens of projects very similar to this throughout the Mid-Atlantic, and he lives in North Carolina, by the way. He's probably our most local team member, and he can speak very specifically to how that could be done. But yes, so the intent is to preserve as much of the standing trees that are currently on the site, and there's a number of very large specimen trees, and even in the areas where we're showing development, and that's based primarily, again, on topographic issues, we have attempted to capture those and integrate those into the detailed plan of all those areas. So as a standard for developing a parcel like this, we have a high degree of confidence that a lot of that existing timber could be retained in place. And when Scott comes back, we'll ask him if you'd like, or you can ask him after the presentation. You can discuss. Scott, we just got a question regarding. And I forgot to. I need to repeat the question, so you can listen here. The question was, does the green area, in theory, represent existing land and vegetation that could be retained in place, relatively intact, with the development of this property, based on these principles? Hold on. Come on up. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, Scott White.
To the extent we were able to walk the site and look at it, it's very healthy woodland, a lot of regeneration underneath a pretty healthy canopy. Looks like maybe anywhere from 40, 50 years old. I don't know when they stopped farming there. Uneven, but yeah, I think I didn't see a lot of invasive exotics and things like that, so I think there's a lot of good regeneration going on. You'd be able to keep that and let that forest continue to grow and develop. No, absolutely not.
Thank you, Scott. And I'm just looking, by the way, this was my cheat sheet, which is going to go up on the board along with the plan so that you can see a lot of the features that we've incorporated in the plan. One of the things that's on the cheat sheet here, speaking to another aspect of some of the things we would be recommending, this is that low area that we talked about preserving as open space. This is a lot of the sites we worked on. We worked on a project called Crothers Farms. It's now called Crothers Farms outside of Nashville, Tennessee, where the existing habitat had been tremendously degraded. It was a dairy farm. It had been overgrazed. And so we actually were able to retain a lot of the existing meadows and restore those back with native species and native plants. And that was a project I did with Scott, and that is, in fact, exists now. So we actually proposed doing a similar thing for that area there. So the intent is to preserve as much of the existing timbered, wooded areas, and then actually go back and help reconstitute and existing natural habitat as it would have existed. So moving on, this is the water retention facilities that we're showing. Even with the best practices, stormwater management, we're still anticipating that there may be some need for retention facilities, and these are the areas where they would most likely be located. And we just want to show those in there. These are the civic sites, which we talked about previously, that being the civic amenity, whatever that might be, the civic use, whether it's a community center and or potentially a charter school, and then that is the existing farmstead that would be preserved and rehabilitated again in its a historic state. And then these are the civic sites plus parks. So these are all the formal parks, neighborhood parks that are in the plan right now as it currently stands. And then, of course, the trail network. And when this is all overlaid, obviously, with the preserved green area, you can see it's a substantial amount of space. But this is, you can see here, without the tree canopy in the drawing, how interconnected the various parts of the neighborhoods in the community would be through the existing natural corridors. There we go. Now you can see it all back together again. So it's really quite extensive, both how the intrinsic value of the property has been both maintained and enhanced, and how great pains have been taken to ensure that those are fully leveraged by the future residents of this community. So just to kind of circle back to where we are, or where we started, this is the final draft community vision plan. That's the summary of everything we've heard this week and our own efforts to translate that into a set of tangible responses, both to your input and to what the site has been telling us, and to do it in a way that we think creates the opportunity to justify putting all of this thought and care into the development of this property if it is in fact developed. That this, I think, is both technically feasible and hopefully financially feasible and market feasible with the support and input of the community, which we very much appreciated from this week. We would welcome any additional comments, because this is not the final plan. We will take all of the work products that we produced this week and put it together into a document. So we're more or less summarizing everything we heard, the things that we responded to in generating this plan, and any additional refinements from the feedback that we get today. And then that will be the basis, as we said, for sort of informing the negotiations between the town on behalf of the residents and the property owners in determining how best to develop this property, balancing out all of those considerations. I think anything else, anything I missed, guys, or do you think we're pretty much there? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put up the boards and also this, but I think before we do that, happy to take any questions related to the presentation of the process as a whole this week. Yes, ma'am. Well, yeah, sure. The question is it within our purview to request green roofs? The answer is if the community says they would like that to be in the code, we could certainly do that. I will say this, that this is by definition a very green community, and the application of green roofs are fairly specific. The purpose of green roofs, there's a couple things. Obviously, you want to reduce I believe it's called the, I forgot now the name of it, but it's the heat absorption on flat roofs. And so now the current building codes, and I'm an architect as well, so we deal with this all the time, but the energy codes now are way beyond what they were 20 or 30 years ago, and they're actually far surpass the best practices of only a generation ago in terms of insulation, in terms of roof colors and things like that. Generally speaking, green roofs are mostly used on large commercial buildings with flat roofs because they're the ones that have the most significant impact. The other reason why green roofs are often used is because you can use them almost like a water retention facility to absorb the water and release it slowly and filter it as you're doing that. This is kind of intrinsic to the plan here as it is. We're also talking about incorporating bioswales and things like that, all of which essentially do the same thing. It's all about managing the water quantity, the rate of flow, and the water quality. And these communities, as we showed with the Carolina Coastal Conservancy study, is already way ahead of conventional suburbia in that regard. Yes, ma'am. No, that was our benchmark. I'm sorry. The question was, thank you. Right. Well, we're not projecting anything. We are showing and illustrating based on what the benchmark community next door, our lot size are, and I'm going to tell you that answer in a second. The question was, are we projecting that the lot sizes for the larger lots will be 1/3 of an acre minimum? And the answer is, what did we draw them at? About 1/3 of an acre. So, well, again, that was the size that we drew them at. What would set the minimum would be whatever you put in the code if you want a minimum. I'm sorry? And that was for the edge condition. That's correct. Will be smaller. But there may be larger lots as well. I'm just saying what we drew for the illustrative platting was consistent with what is across the street in the Forestdale community. Yes, ma'am. Well, the short answer, the question was, did anybody tell us that the farmhouse is not salvageable? We have heard that many people have expressed that opinion. And I can tell you, again, as an architect who's done a lot of adaptive reuse projects, anything is salvageable if you want to salvage it. It's just a question of money and whether or not there's an economic value to justify that. I have not personally looked at the house to make that determination, but I've certainly seen houses that were in no worse condition than that salvaged. It's just a question of finding a motivated entity to make that happen. Okay, the question was, where does the baseball fields come in? And they're not baseball fields, that was a soccer field. I think it's a school and an athletic field. So again, in 4 days, what we are able to do is put in a placeholder representing some kind of recreational use associated with that school. In this particular case, we drew a soccer field. Yes.
We're also somewhat light imprint on this.
Yes.
You also mentioned a minute ago you're not going to scrape the wood. You could put 15 ball fields on this side, but you would be mass scraping.
Yes.
So it's a little more sensitive approach to the design. Maybe the ball fields need to go somewhere else.
Yeah, the response was that we could obviously put 15 ball fields on the site. That was an open field, by the way. We thought it was a good use to put on the plan for discussion purposes as the community continues to move forward with this process. But that was an open field. It's adjacent to a good location for a community facility, a civic community, which is also adjacent to an existing historic building, which would be easier to justify restoring if they were all put together in the same place and became an asset not only to this property, but to Jamestown as a whole. Any other questions? Yes.
In your detailed sketch that showed the townhouses in this sector,
Yes.
I was surprised that with the parking. I would have assumed that since they're residences, there would be garages,
Yes.
storage, and cars.
Sure. So I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, am I correct that the townhouses as planned don't have garages?
In fact, they do, but the question was, is he correct that the townhouses as planned don't have garages? In fact, I'd be happy to go back and show you, but there are garages there. It's important to remember when we have this conversation that we were doing about 10 things simultaneously in 4 days that are normally done, at a detail level over a much longer period of time. Everybody on the team has designed communities that are built and out there right now based on these principles and based on similar house types to what we're illustrating here. So we haven't drawn anything that we know is not feasible at a technical detail level. But for the purposes of facilitating the conversation this week with the community, obviously we are drawing things to be able to talk about those things in general. But actually, let me just back up because I want to show you the garages. And we put them in there not because we thought these are garage doors. Not because we're going to be breaking ground on those tomorrow, but because we recognize that even people that live in townhouses typically drive cars. And so I'm very confident that this plan could be built out as represented in this illustration. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. These were the small, and again, this could just as easily be a single-family house, but these were the small mansion flats that there was pretty broad support for based on our surveys. So all of these things are essentially an illustrative placeholder for things that we heard from the community that there was support for. We think this would be a good location for that house type for people who would like to live in a very maintenance-free house very close to neighborhood amenities. Okay, I'm sorry. Were you hearing any of the early? Okay, sorry. I think there's a picture of one up here somewhere. It's right here. I'm sorry. The question was, what is a small mansion flat? A mansion flat is... No, it's not an apartment with a fancy word. It's a building type that resembles a large single-family detached house, but it's subdivided into condos for people. Yes, exactly. I'm sorry, I was trying to answer the question, but thank you for your assistance with that. We're putting condos there. People live in a lot of different things, and my mother lives in a condo, just so you know, and she's a pretty nice lady. Okay, any other questions? The hand went up right back there. Yes, ma'am. Yes. No, okay, the question is, the green parks appear to be a different color than the textured graphic. Okay, well, first of all, when you say clear cut, again, this is a neighborhood just like a neighborhood that was across the street, certain trees were cut in order to make that neighborhood across the street. What we are showing, in fact, what we originally showed in the early illustrations was that this is a wooded area, and we put a green there specifically to try to retain as many of those trees as possible. Now, some of those trees could be dead in a year or two of natural causes. So the point is that we try to, when we get to the detailed level of planning of the neighborhoods, to try, and this particular approach to development provides the flexibility to actually do that. We can show you examples of where we've done that in other projects. We can minimize the amount of loss of trees to the fullest extent possible. The only way to preserve all of those trees is to leave the property in its existing state, which is not a conversation for me. That's not something that I can give you an answer to. But to answer your question about the illustration, there could be trees in those green areas, and there would be trees in those green areas if there were trees there that were warranted preserving. This is a graphic to show where the parks are relative to the natural vegetated tree stands are there. So all this is right now is an illustration to allow us to have a conversation about these ideas. But thank you for the question, because it's a good point, and it was good to be able to clarify that. Yes, ma'am.
I know you have now figured out how to connect the bottom right hand
Yes.
with the other part, but did you ever consider that to be a good location for a school?
In fact, it would be, I mean, there's a couple of places where there could be a school here located, certainly. And schools have their own sort of location criteria, just like a library or any other large destination use. So if there was a conversation between the town, if the town and the residents felt that a school was an important component to have in this community, and that was a good location to potentially have one, we could certainly look at one there. The idea, again, this is a diagram that shows where these types of uses and amenities and things of value like neighborhoods and so forth could be located with the minimum amount of disturbance of the existing site, flora and fauna, and the minimum environmental impact and the maximum value to the community as a whole. So certainly, as we move forward, that could be part of the conversation, absolutely. The question was whether the impact of this community in terms of infrastructure, services, et cetera. Dave, you want to answer that question? Was it part of the consideration of this particular exercise this week?
Sort of in a parallel move, several months ago, we had a strategic growth plan meeting, and we invited in the schools, we invited in the sheriff's office, we invited in the Pinecroft Sedgefield Fire Department, we invited in High Point, Greensboro, the Partnership for Water in Our Wastewater. We're taking a look at sanitation pickup in terms of recycling and garbage. And so we're looking at the services, we're looking at the income, looking at expenses just to make sure that everything works. But we have participating with Pinecroft Sedgefield in a 50% basis to determine the site of a fire station for this area. And with 40 years as a town manager, I've located many fire stations, and it's based on service, and it's pretty precise where you would want to put them. And so we are working to see where that would be to get the maximum coverage. We do enjoy a Class 2 fire rating, 1 being the best in the state, and we have a 2, and that's quite remarkable for our town. And the other thing is, in talking with the sheriff's office, they do have a district office here in town, but they're not ones that are located based off of areas. They serve a much larger area, and probably it could be 10, 12, 14,000 people, and they have district offices. And so what we may be doing, rather than building another place, we would be adding additional officers that we would be paying for. We do have a contract with them. So right now, I think we have 4.5 officers that we have. And then if we are adding additional to provide the same level of service, so they're not particularly tied down to a location. And so probably in October, or certainly early November, the results of the fire study will, and we will know where they need to be. Now, Pine Cross Sedgefield serves not just the town of Jamestown, and as you know, they're located in our facility over here, but they're looking to where they need to be, not just with growth in this area, but also, within their total fire district area.
Anybody, maybe some new names, yes, sir, new faces.
Yeah, I think this has been a really good process. I think it's really good that representatives of the board are here as well. You mentioned the Kentlands earlier.
Yes.
And I remember that project from the late 80s. I traveled in that area, and it was a local developer who did it, and really nicely done. And he got over his head like a lot of us did back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And really nice. It went back to bank, and then the bank brought in a number of different developers to
Right.
work with the project. And I think you made this advice with the bank. And so it hasn't really, and it was a real prototype of new urbanism, as you said. It didn't quite turn out the way he wanted it originally, but it's been pretty good. I mean, it's a nice development.
Right.
It's been done.
Right.
But here's my question. Is with that in mind, and that was kind of presented as as sort of a comparison standpoint from size. And I'm not really trying to put anybody on the spot with this
Right.
question, and I don't expect a precise answer, but matching up these visions that we're doing here with the realities of the ownership and the business of who owns this particular property in Jamestown, vastly different from the local developer that did that. I went back to the bank versus a national and a very well-renowned and good home builder that's done things across the country. There's just a real juxtaposition there between the two. And I'm just still struggling with how this meets that.
Well, it's a good question, and thank you for that. And the statement was a reference to Kentland's early build-out, in the early 1990s. The timing was not great. Basically, there was a recession just as Kentland was coming out of the ground. And these are very capital-intensive projects compared to conventional suburban developments. So there is a critical stage in the early build-out if you don't have deep pockets. And at that time, that was a brand-new concept, and it was particularly vulnerable to that kind of a downturn. The project was built out more or less. I know Alfondre personally, and I also know his son, who's also a developer. And the project actually did turn out, because I know the people who designed the community, very much like it was intended to be built out. And in fact, it's evolved since it was built out to well beyond what the original vision was, certainly in terms of economic success. It's been a hugely successful project. Keith Covington right over there, and I collectively, Keith lives in West Haven in Metro Nashville, which is in another community that we referenced, West Haven. The developer West Haven had done, up until that project, only high-end gated communities. So that was a completely new concept for them. It's been hugely successful. They're making way more money than they were making just building McMansions for wealthy people. But there was a learning curve there. And Keith would be happy to talk to you about it if you're interested. And then another project that we worked on in that area is now being built out by a large regional builder. And again, this was a regional builder who had built very conventional suburban communities up until fairly recently, and then they realized that there was a huge amount of market demand for these types of communities, and that they could both make money and build real places that people wanted to live that would add value to the larger community in which they're located. So it's been, these Ketlands was built over 30 years ago. It's a huge success by any definition, and it is maintained, not only is it maintained throughout its build-out and continued lifespan, to all the basic principles that informed its planning and design. It's only become more and more valuable, but more importantly, it's completely changed the building pattern, development pattern, in around that part of Maryland, and it's very close to where I live. So nobody in Montgomery County, Maryland right now would dream of building a large community in that county that didn't reflect those principles in some way, shape, or form. Not only because there's tremendous market demand for it, but that's what people value the most with their pocketbooks. So, but thank you for the question, very good question. And by the way, feel free to talk to Keith about all of this afterwards. I'm sure he'll be happy to share some of his experience doing this as well. Any questions back there, over there? Yes, ma'am? Yes. Yes, the question is, acknowledging that we believe that this is a greener, more sustainable form of development, are there any other things that could be done to make it even greener? The short answer is obviously yes. We do show some surface parking lots in that rendering. Again, if we want to make it greener, we would do that with impervious pavers, or we would have bioswales in the tree planters. I was just reading an article this morning. We talked a little bit about on-street parking. We normally encourage on-street parking in the neighborhood centers, which have more, for two reasons. One, they tend to have more traffic movements, and by having on-street parking, the parked cars actually provide a barrier between the cars and the pedestrians on the sidewalk. They feel more comfortable, and they're protected by that parked car. But the other reason is because that's typically where the higher density house types are located. All that on-street parking is essentially guest parking. So we normally design these communities where you have off-street parking for the residents of each townhouse, but you have guest parking up and down every street. And there was a comment when we talked about on-street parking one of the earlier evenings that, oh, well, people hit parked cars. Well, they do if the streets are really wide and the through traffic is encouraged to speed. But normally, because we try to design the streets to the nearest dimension possible relative to their intended use, cars travel more slowly, and the on-street parked cars actually encourage that, because if they don't drive slowly, all they're going to do is wreck their own car. But the other thing is that what they're doing now, both to make it even safer for pedestrians, and also to answer your question, is a lot of communities are designing, are putting bulb outs at the intersections to shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians, but they're also using the bulb outs as, again, bioretention swales. And then they will also do those mid-block as traffic calming devices. So you're sort of solving two problems at the same time. You're helping to further encourage drivers to drive slowly, but you're also reducing the need for retention ponds and the like. So the other thing is that just because it's important to understand that in most of these lighter colored areas, if there's any standing mature trees, those are the lots that are big enough to allow you to site the house in a way that would allow as many of those trees to remain standing on those properties. And again, in our projects, that's typically exactly how those lots are developed. So there actually would be potentially many, many more trees than this diagram is showing. But for clarity purposes and for the discussion this afternoon, we removed this. We actually had them on the plan and we decided it was too distracting, so we took them off. So it's important to remember this is still very much an illustrative plan that is to be used as a basis for ongoing discussions between the residents, the town, and the property owner, not as a final design. So, if we want to put a school in a different location, that's great, but now you actually have something that you can refer to specifically to facilitate that conversation. The other thing is, when you have a plan like this that's already taking you so far down the road towards a sustainable community where sensitive design is an integral part of the process, it's much, much easier to go back as you continue to move through the detailed site plan development and the individual lot development to integrate those kinds of practices. We've done lots of projects where there is actually coding for things like renewable energy, solar panels, and so forth. So you can always add that in. And that could be done when we get to the coding part for this project. But the most important thing is this project, by its very nature and the way that it's designed and the way that it interfaces with the property, excuse me, is already intrinsically way more green than most development that takes place in a more conventional way. So you start with a much stronger foundation, and then you build on that as you go. And Keith wanted to remind me one more time that this is an illustrative plan intended to facilitate a conversation. It represents everything that we heard this week from the community applied to this specific piece of ground and based on and informed by our own experience with similar projects and the principles that we typically design to. But first and foremost, it represents your input. But it's mostly here so that we now have, as a community, a shared frame of reference to continue this conversation. Yes. Oh. Yes.
Suburbs of Gaithersburg or suburbs of Nashville, or it sounds like a bit like a suburb of Jamestown. And I'm just wondering, do you have past experience with designing something this big for a community this small?
The short answer is yes. We've designed communities bigger than this for communities smaller than this, and we've designed communities smaller than this for communities much bigger than this. We've been I think Dave misspoke when he said I've been doing this for 30 years. He's given me a little bit too. Some of them, absolutely. Some of them were. Yeah, we applied these principles in pretty much every market context that you can imagine, in terms of income, in terms of population, in terms of density. We've done them in rural communities. We've done them in very urbanized communities. You respond to the context both in terms of the existing community and the existing market context. But the principles have the ability, and that's why they were so successful certainly through the Depression, as a basic template for all community development, because it had the ability to accommodate a wide range of situations and economic needs, but it also they were adaptable. Conventional suburban projects were basically one and done because they were so specific to their intended use. Perfect example are regional malls. Regional malls are dying all over the country because they were designed for a single purpose and a single type of consumer behavior, neither of which is relevant anymore. You know what they're turning into? They're turning into communities like this. So, we can have this conversation all day long, but I will say if you're referencing my references, I'm only using a very small portion of the projects that I have direct personal familiarity with, and the team collectively probably would cover the entire spectrum of communities throughout the U.S. Sure. Sure. Yes. Right.
We in the audience are not just concerned with how this property is developed, but how our town will grow.
Sure, I understand. In that you're exactly like every single other town we've ever done this process in. So we're not naive enough to assume that those aren't factors and considerations, but they're not factors and considerations for this specific community visioning exercise. And we understand that there are many, many steps that any property owner of this property would have to go through in order to develop it, and that there are many opportunities for the residents in this room and throughout Jamestown to weigh in on that. On that. So we understand all that. It's part and parcel of every single project we work on, whether we're representing the municipality, which we do as often as we're representing a developer or landowner. So this is, you know, we understand all of that, and there's nothing here that related to the specific things that we were asked to put on the table for discussion that is any different than any other community that we've worked in. Well, you'll remember, yeah, the question was who asked us. Nobody asked us to. At the opening night presentation, we said there are a number of prominent or predominant community development models that are currently being implemented throughout this country in communities very similar to Jamestown. Based on that fact, we made an opening night presentation to talk about those two models. There is what was a third implied model, which was that no development of that parcel takes place at all. But the basis on which we initiated this exercise at the request of the town on behalf of the citizens was to say if we move forward with a visioning, planning process on the assumption that that property has a intrinsic economic value, which will likely mean that at some point it will be developed. Would you rather, decide how that development happens? Would you rather have two lawyers decide that, or would you rather have a process which would allow the community to voice their preferences? We framed that conversation on the basis of the two predominant development patterns currently typical of properties that size in communities of this size. And we gave everybody who participated an opportunity to weigh in. First of all, we talked about the pros and cons of both, and there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of documentation out there to support how we presented that. And the community weighed back in, and at the beginning of this presentation, I went through and reiterated the results of those surveys. And unless the people who participated in that process felt that anything that was misrepresented to them, they told us, based on the current prevailing models of primary home community development in this market, in this country, in this state, all of which we have a great deal of experience with, everybody on the team, which of these two would you prefer, including not at all? And that was an option. It was an option on the survey. Okay, thank you. Oh wait, there was one back in the back. I'm sorry. Raise. Sure. Yes, neighborhood serving. I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the question. Yes, and the question was, do we? Well, in the illustration in the plan, the question was, where do we have the parking in the retail area? For small-scale retail like that, at the level of economic value that it would represent, the most likely parking format would be surface parking. And in both the plan and in the illustration, we showed that behind the retail area and between the retail and the buffer and the vegetated buffer, basically the 100-foot wide trees strip that we are proposing based on input from the community will be preserved. So it's the least impactful area in terms of the quality of the environment in that neighborhood, the walking environment in that neighborhood, and also nobody from the street will see any of that parking. So it's You won't see it from the road, you won't see it from the neighborhood, you won't see it from any of the adjoining properties. And again, there's plenty of examples of this type of development in this type of community out there, and we'd be happy to give you those examples. Yes, ma'am.
Wondering, how does this plan overlay kind of compare to other DR Horton neighborhoods?
I have no idea. We didn't look at that, but I will say this. The area of developed land versus the area of preserved land, and when I say preserved, meaning it will either be preserved in its current state or be able to be rehabilitated in its current state. A third of a site, that's a pretty remarkable number. Now, I will say this, a lot of what's driving that is the intrinsic character of the site itself. There's a lot of steep slopes, there's a lot of stream buffers and so forth. So if you're going to build an office park on that site, you might end up with a 30% utilization as well. So I'm not saying that there's anything necessarily magic about that, but the way that we placed that community on that site, we believe minimizes the amount of disturbed area, the amount of grading, the impact on the existing flora and fauna, the impact on the existing natural systems and wildlife corridors. So we think it's a reasonable, again, based on our experience, working in similar communities on similar projects in similar markets, we believe this is the best balance between economic benefit and preservation of natural resources and community character, because we've gone to great lengths, as we've illustrated over the course of the week, to draw on local examples to illustrate the different components of the neighborhoods as designed. But we've also made the point, in order to preserve all of that open space and to preserve the character of those existing neighborhoods, or to reflect those, there needs to be some mechanism to make that happen. And we believe we've showed that where other communities have adopted a similar approach, like Kentlands and West Haven and so forth and so on, nobody was adversely impacted in terms of home valuations or neighborhood valuations. In fact, every single one of the communities we've referenced are way outperforming the benchmarks, the comps in the area of conventional community development. And the people who have been making out like bandits in those communities are actually the first buyers who got in before anybody understood what the market valuations were, and they were priced to reflect whatever the current, market pricing is. Keith's the perfect example of that. He doesn't even have to work anymore. He could retire right now, just based on what he's made on his house in West Haven. And yes. Yes. Yeah.
We're in a better place in terms of the tree preservation and everything.
Yeah.
And just that it has that farm quality remain. So, I don't know much about the builder, so I was just wondering, is it, like, you feel confident that this is like our starting point, and they can take it from here
Right.
and be successful at?
I don't personally have a lot of experience working with D.R. Horton because, our typical clients build communities like this as a matter of course. But I will say this, the builder that is building out our project in Crothers Crossing, or Crothers Farms now, was basically a large regional production builder, very similar to D.R. Horton in terms of their business model, and certainly in terms of the scale and nature of the communities that they built out. And they recognized that there was a real interest in this type of community, and that they could build communities that were more sensitive to that demand and be more successful for doing so. And same thing with the developer West Haven. They were just basically building, gated McMansions out on the periphery of Nashville, and now they probably have one of the most successful, well, they have the most successful, on a per acre basis, hands down, the most successful project in all of Greater Nashville. By the way, Nashville right now is a super hot market, and that's also in downtown. And Keith worked for Metro Nashville. He was a planner for Metro Nashville, so he was part of revitalizing those older pre-war neighborhoods that everybody wants to live in right now. And they still can't compete with West Haven. So it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Somebody doesn't have to lose in order for somebody else to win. We can all win, but the first step is working together to sort of understand how to make this a positive outcome for everybody. So, and to get back to your question about D.R. Horton, I don't have personal experience working with D.R. Horton, but we did look at some of the house types that they were building, and I do know that in markets where this type of community is the preferred community format from a consumer point of view, they are developing new house types specifically for this. So part of it is making your preferences known in a productive and informed and concise and clear way, and we're hopeful that this will help facilitate that conversation. Yes, ma'am.
What two districts were we talking about the first time? The only one I remember is the TND, traditional neighborhood.
If you've got, it's not still on the laptop, is it, the first night's presentation?
Yes, it's under all presentations.
Hey, you have the same bookkeeping strategy. I mean, I can explain it to you, but I'd be happy to show it to you. The question was, what were the two districts? They weren't really districts. They were, we called them community formats, community development formats. And we picked two very specific ones. I mean, you could say, generic suburbia. I mean, you've got plenty of it around here, obviously, to pick from. But the one that we specifically picked as the alternative was one in which the house types and price points were typically clustered together in a single residential pod, often with a single entrance, and then the roads that service those pods had no houses that fronted on them directly. They were just a way to get access to the pods, and the pods were all distinct in terms of lifestyle, cost, et cetera, et cetera. And the other one was this, which was really based on a pre-war model of walkable neighborhoods, neighborhood-based, not pod, but neighborhood-based, where the neighborhoods were built based on really sort of timeless principles, but connectivity, mix of housing types and prices, access to local parks and schools, et cetera, et cetera. So those were the two alternatives that we put out there. Now there's a whole gradient between those two alternatives. We only had 4 days, so we wanted to, kind of cut to the chase a little bit, or at least narrow it down, and that gave us the ability to say, and by the way, we could end up somewhere in between that through this process. If somebody had said, we really like pods, we said, okay, well, that's what we're going to draw. But when we walked through and we explained the differences, when we walked through and explained the pros and cons, when we provided visual examples of the two and some of the challenges of each, because I don't want to say this is necessarily perfect. I mean, every neighborhood has its issues, or every community format has its issues. But when you weigh all the pros and cons, this one has been remarkably enduring. And evidence of that is after World War II, when the GIs all came home and we were prospering as a country, everybody went out and bought a car. And then we said, well, all of those old principles no longer apply. We're just going to drive everywhere. Everything will be great. Everything will be convenient and easy. And then we realized that there were unanticipated consequences of that lifestyle. Traffic congestion, environmental degradation, spending 2 or 3 hours a day in our cars, commuting back and forth to work. And all of a sudden, people started saying, well, this isn't what we were expecting. And then back in the late 1980s, we said, well, wait, there's a model that can accommodate all that, and it's been accommodating it for hundreds of years, certainly decades, if not hundreds of years. And that's where the interest in reconstituting that approach to community building began to emerge, and it's been probably the fastest trending, and continues to be the fastest trending building format in the home building and community building industry since. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
Can we look at the renderings
Sure. And I had intended to have more renderings, but this was, you know, when we start these things, and there will be more, by the way, by the time we're finished, because the intention was to render each one of those conditions based on this plan, and we just ran out of time. And we were focusing on the, I'd like to really get that circle off there, but I guess we'll have to live with it. So this was the village center, and identifying the focused retail area, and that's, you know, that's the scale that it can be, if that's what the community would like to see. And then we had this one, which was exiting one of the neighborhood edge conditions, and that's, by the way, let me show you my sketch again, so you guys get a little sense of the.
Are you planning for the streets to be that narrow?
I drew that literally in about 15 minutes. So this was my sketch.
It's pretty impressive for 15 minutes.
Yeah. So that was my rough. I shot that with my phone this morning, sent it to Peter Roper in Montreal, and that's what I got back this afternoon. That's what I got back about 2 hours ago. That's what I got back about 2 minutes before the meeting started. And you might recognize it because it's about 2 blocks over here, and we loved it. I mean, it's gorgeous. And but the idea is it doesn't, you know, this approach gives you so many options and so much flexibility. And you know the old saying, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." Well, to preserve almost 70% of a site's open space, you know, something, you know, you have to figure out a way to justify that or pay for that. And not everybody wants to live. I mean, I know a lot of people who are moving from houses like this into you know, townhomes or condos because they don't want to mow the lawn anymore. They want to deal with all that. So the idea isn't to say it's all this or nothing. The idea is to say it can be both and. It can be this and that.
I think the last time around, it was very much about price point. It was
Yeah.
very much about like each, you know, serving
Right.
houses that were $250,000 or less.
Right.
You know, and so everything was very much the same. So I mean,
Well, there's a lot of things that drive, I mean, there's a lot of very,
central focus, right?
right. Well, the thing is, it's kind of ironic. We put up some pictures in the opening night presentation of both West Haven and Crothers. The houses are virtually identical in terms of the exterior appearance, and probably actually in terms of the construction costs. When we're talking about the different factors that influence the market pricing at Crothers Farms and West Haven, and probably there's a number of variables that contribute to that, but probably the single biggest factor is the school districts, and which has nothing to do with any of the things we've been talking about today, other than the fact that I suspect that now that Crothers Farms exists, their school district is going to start getting a lot better very quickly. But it's one of the reasons why it's important to talk about all of this stuff at the level of detail that we're talking about is because it all matters, I mean, ultimately. And so if you want to live in a walkable, sustainable community that accommodates, you know, every stage of life, every housing preference and so forth, you have to design it for that. And this is how we've done it, and we know, and many other people have done it very successfully, and in a way that reflects the local traditions and local character of the communities in which they're built. And the biggest problem all of these communities have is that if Keith sold his house in West Haven today, he could not afford to move back in there. They get so valuable so quickly. It's a real challenge. But it's, you know, it's a challenge that some communities wouldn't mind having. I think there was one other rendering in here. Oh yeah, this was the very first one we did, and I thought we were going to use it to talk to. It's the one with the. Actually, I don't know. We did this one here. Because this is a diagram. That's how we look at it. It's just a means of talking to an idea, but it allows us to do it in a more precise way. So here's the townhouses. They're on the village green. Here's the civic building. Here's, you know, the edge. This, you know, you could be driving out of here and drive right into that other rendering. And that's really, if you go back and you look at the plans, that's essentially what it's showing. And now, instead of just having this neighborhood, every single neighborhood within the larger community, within the 467 acres, will have its own character. But the principles, the underlying principles will be the same. And we're going to continue, like I said, to refine this and produce additional exhibits to help ensure that we've captured all the input, and also to make sure that everything that we've talked about is clearly understood and translated. But it's everything you've seen in this rendering could be applied to this neighborhood, to this neighborhood, to this neighborhood, or any other neighborhood that might be developed in Jamestown if you wanted to apply these principles to other properties. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Everything here is just an idea. It's a vision plan. Right.
So my question is, when you're building these houses,
Yes.
do you plan on leaving any
Yes.
existing trees?
Yes. Again, if you walk out the door, 2 minutes down the street over there, you'll see that picture. And that's exactly how they were built. Right.
So you are going to leave some existing trees?
We will leave trees where it's practical to do so, but again, the thing that allows us to do that where it's practical to do so is some of those house types that people don't want to have trees on because they don't want to have to deal with them, they don't want them falling on their houses, they don't want to have to pick up the leaves, et cetera. Sure.
The charm of this area here, I don't know if people realize it or not, but like Guilford College, a lot of people walk down Guilford College, you see
Sure.
dogs and kids and bikes.
Yeah.
People, and the reason why, which a lot of people doesn't understand, is that whole area there is just big, huge shaded trees.
Right. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room understands exactly what you're talking about, but yes, and
Well, and that's why I'm talking about this.
right, I understand.
That's what would draw people to buy houses like this.
Yes.
Because of that same feel.
Yes.
That Jamestown has.
Yes.
Carrying over into a project.
I think we couldn't agree more, but thank you for your comment. I think we've covered most of, unless there's any other topic-specific conversation related to the presentation today, I would certainly invite everybody to come up and take a look at the master. This is really interesting because this does a much better job of explaining all the stuff that's in here than I have. But also feel free to talk to the team members because there's a wealth of information, relevant information that they have and experience that relate to a lot of the questions that you had today. But thank you all for coming and thank you for participating this week.